The morning air was cold and biting, the kind that stung your cheeks and made every breath visible. Daniel Carter stood outside the bakery on 5th Street at exactly 6:15 a.m., just like he did every weekday morning. His daughter Emma, only 7 years old, held his hand tightly, her small fingers wrapped around his calloused palm. She wore a pink jacket that was slightly too big, handed down from a cousin, and her backpack bounced against her shoulders as they walked. Daniel worked the early shift at a construction site across town, and every morning he dropped Emma at her school's breakfast program before heading to work. The routine was strict, timed to the minute, because being late meant losing pay he couldn't afford to lose. But this morning, like every morning for the past 3 weeks, Daniel paused at the corner near the bus stop. Sitting on the cold concrete, wrapped in layers of torn blankets and faded clothing, was an elderly woman. Her face was weathered and kind, her eyes holding stories that no one seemed to stop long enough to hear. A small cardboard sign rested against her knee, the words barely legible in the dim streetlight. "Anything helps. God bless." Most people walked past her without a glance. Some actively avoided her gaze. Daniel had been one of those people once, until Emma had tugged on his sleeve 3 weeks ago and asked why the lady looked so sad. Since that day, Daniel had made it part of their routine. He would stop at the bakery, buy 2 breakfast sandwiches and 2 coffees, one for him and one for the woman. Emma would hand her the paper bag with the brightest smile, and the woman, whose name they learned was Margaret, would thank them with tears glistening in her eyes. It wasn't much. Daniel knew that. He was barely making ends meet himself, raising Emma alone after his wife had passed 2 years earlier from an illness that drained their savings and left him with debts he was still paying off. But Emma's innocence and compassion reminded him every day that kindness didn't require wealth. It required heart. If you believe that small acts of kindness can change the world, then make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. And before the story continues, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your city might be featured in an upcoming story. This particular Thursday morning felt different. Margaret looked weaker than usual, her hands shaking as she accepted the warm sandwich. Daniel crouched down beside her, concern creasing his forehead. "Are you all right, Margaret?" he asked softly. She nodded slowly, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Just tired, dear, just very tired." Emma squeezed her father's hand and whispered, "Daddy, can we stay a little longer?" Daniel glanced at his watch. He was already cutting it close, but something in Margaret's frail appearance made him pause. He nodded at Emma and sat down on the curb beside the elderly woman, ignoring the strange looks from passing commuters. They stayed for 10 minutes, Emma chatting about her upcoming school play, Margaret listening with genuine interest despite her obvious exhaustion. When Daniel finally stood to leave, Margaret reached out and grasped his hand with surprising strength. "You're a good man, Daniel Carter," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't ever forget that. Goodness always finds its way back." Daniel smiled, squeezed her hand gently, and walked Emma to school. He made it to the construction site 15 minutes late, which earned him a sharp warning from his foreman and a dock in his paycheck. But he didn't regret it. The following Monday morning, something was wrong. Margaret wasn't at her usual spot. The corner looked empty and cold without her presence. Daniel felt a knot form in his stomach. Emma noticed too, her face falling as they approached the vacant spot. "Where's Miss Margaret, Daddy?" she asked, her voice small and worried. Daniel didn't have an answer. They waited a few minutes, hoping she had simply stepped away, but she never appeared. They left the sandwich and coffee on the bench with a note that read, "For Margaret, we hope you're okay." Daniel and Emma. For 3 days, Margaret didn't return. Daniel and Emma continued their routine, leaving food each morning, but the bags remained untouched. Daniel began to fear the worst. He asked nearby shopkeepers, other homeless individuals in the area, anyone who might have seen her. No one knew anything. The city had a way of swallowing people whole, making them disappear without a trace. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after their last conversation with Margaret, everything changed. Daniel and Emma arrived at the corner at their usual time, but instead of emptiness, they found something that made Daniel stop dead in his tracks. A sleek black Mercedes was parked along the curb, and standing near their usual spot were 5 men in dark suits. Clearly bodyguards based on their stance and the way their eyes scanned the surroundings. Between them stood 2 individuals in expensive business attire, a man and a woman, both carrying leather briefcases. And in the center of this unusual gathering, sitting in a wheelchair, being carefully attended to, was Margaret. But she looked different. Her hair was clean and styled. She wore a proper coat. And though she still appeared frail, there was a dignity in her posture that hadn't been visible before. Emma gasped softly, and Daniel instinctively pulled her closer. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them making sense. Had Margaret been arrested? Was she in trouble? Were they in trouble for helping her? The woman in the business suit noticed them first. She approached with measured steps, her expression professional but not unkind. "Mr. Daniel Carter?" she asked, her voice clear and authoritative. Daniel nodded slowly, his throat suddenly dry. "Yes, that's me. Is everything all right? Is Margaret okay?" The woman's expression softened slightly. "My name is Patricia Donovan, and I'm Mrs. Margaret Holloway's attorney. This is my colleague, James Chen. We've been looking for you." Daniel's confusion deepened. Margaret Holloway, attorney. Nothing made sense. Margaret smiled from her wheelchair, and this time her smile was full and genuine, reaching her tired eyes. "Daniel, dear boy, come here, please. Bring Emma." Daniel approached cautiously, Emma hiding slightly behind his leg. The bodyguards maintained their positions but didn't seem threatening, merely vigilant. Patricia Donovan opened her briefcase and pulled out several documents. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Holloway has quite a story to tell you. But first, I need to verify some information. Have you been providing Mrs. Holloway with food and assistance every morning for approximately 3 weeks?" Daniel nodded, still bewildered. "Yes, we just wanted to help. She looked like she needed it." Patricia exchanged a glance with her colleague before continuing. "And you never asked her for anything in return? Never sought recognition or compensation?" "Of course not," Daniel said, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his voice. "She's a human being who needed help. That's all that mattered." Margaret reached out her hand, and Daniel instinctively took it. Her grip was warm despite the cold morning air. "Tell him, Patricia," Margaret said softly. "Tell him everything." Patricia cleared her throat and began to explain. Margaret Holloway wasn't just any homeless woman. She was the widow of Richard Holloway, founder of Holloway Technologies, one of the largest tech companies in the region. When Richard passed away 5 years ago, he left behind a fortune estimated at over $200 million. But Richard had also left behind a very specific and unusual clause in his will. He had seen too many people in his life motivated solely by money, too many relationships built on greed rather than genuine care. So he had created a test. Before we continue, if this story has captured your attention, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your support means everything. And tell us in the comments, would you have stopped to help Margaret? Your answer might inspire someone today. Richard's will stated that Margaret would live on the streets for exactly 6 months, monitored discreetly by security and legal teams, but appearing to the world as destitute and forgotten. During this time, she would observe humanity at its rawest. The will specified that if, during those 6 months, she encountered someone who showed her genuine, repeated kindness without any expectation of reward or recognition, someone who helped her despite having their own struggles, that person would receive a substantial reward. Not the entire fortune, as Margaret would retain the bulk to continue Richard's charitable foundations, but a life-changing amount nonetheless. Daniel felt his knees weaken. Emma tugged on his jacket, confused by all the adult talk. Patricia continued, her voice steady and professional. "Mrs. Holloway has been on the streets for 5 months and 3 weeks. In all that time, only a handful of people ever offered her more than spare change. Most ignored her completely. But you, Mr. Carter, and your daughter Emma, you stopped every single morning. You spent money you clearly couldn't spare. You gave her time when you were already late for work. You sat with her, talked with her, treated her like a person with dignity and worth." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You reminded me why Richard created this test," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You reminded me that goodness still exists in this world, that people like you and Emma still choose compassion over convenience." Patricia pulled out another document. "Mr. Carter, per the terms of Richard Holloway's will, and upon Mrs. Holloway's identification and verification of your character, you are to receive the following: a trust fund of $3 million, to be managed by our firm but fully accessible to you for living expenses, Emma's education, and investment in your future. Additionally, Mrs. Holloway personally would like to offer you a position managing the Community Outreach Division of the Holloway Foundation, with a salary of $120,000 annually, full benefits, and the opportunity to help others the way you helped her." The world seemed to tilt beneath Daniel's feet. Emma looked up at him with wide eyes. "Daddy, are you okay?" He couldn't speak, couldn't process what he was hearing. $3 million, a job. After years of struggling, of drowning in debt, of wondering if he could give Emma the life she deserved. Patricia handed him the documents. "Everything is here in writing. Mr. Carter, our firm has verified Mrs. Holloway's mental competency, the validity of the will, and your identity. This is real. This is happening." Daniel looked at Margaret, this fragile woman who had tested his character without him ever knowing. "I didn't do it for money," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I did it because it was right, because Emma needed to see that we help people, no matter what." Margaret smiled through her tears. "I know, Daniel, that's exactly why you deserve this. Richard always said that the world would be a better place if we rewarded character instead of ambition. You've proven him right." Emma suddenly broke free from her father's side and ran to Margaret, wrapping her small arms around the elderly woman's shoulders. "I'm so glad you're okay, Miss Margaret," she said simply. Margaret held her close, closing her eyes and savoring the pure, uncomplicated love of a child who had seen her as nothing more than a person who needed a friend. As you finish reading this story, if it has touched your heart, please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your engagement keeps these stories of hope and humanity alive. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Daniel's place? Your answer might encourage someone facing a similar choice today. Daniel Carter stood on that cold street corner, surrounded by lawyers and bodyguards, holding documents that would change his life forever. But the warmth he felt didn't come from the promise of money or security. It came from knowing that the simple choice he had made every morning, the choice to see another human being and respond with kindness, had mattered. Emma would go to college without debt. The medical bills would finally be paid. They would have a home, stability, a future. But more than that, they would have proof that goodness isn't weakness, that compassion isn't foolishness, and that sometimes the world does recognize the quiet heroes who choose to care. Sometimes life doesn't just close a door. Sometimes it opens a door you never knew existed, one that leads not just to reward, but to the affirmation that your choices, your values, and your heart were right all along. And sometimes the person you help in their darkest moment is exactly the person who will help you find your light. In the end, kindness is never wasted. It's only waiting for the right moment to come home.